For nearly 2 million years, humans ate their food exactly as they found it. No fire, no seasoning, no softening, just raw meat, raw roots, raw everything. Every meal was a fight, tough fibers, raw sinew, hours of grinding, aching jaws. Some researchers estimate our ancient relatives spent up to 6 hours a day just chewing. This was simply life, exhausting, inefficient, and it had been this way for ages. Then, somewhere in that long raw chapter, something quietly began to change. Fire. Long before anyone controlled it, fire already existed, born from lightning, drought, and dry grass. For a long time, early humans could only watch fire happen. They could not yet make it. Sites like Wonderwerk Cave, Swartkrans, and Kubifora hold the earliest hints of controlled fire. Nearly 2 million years ago, something began tending small fires deep inside African caves, not lighting it from nothing yet, but keeping it alive, feeding it, guarding it. That single habit, keeping flame alive, would eventually change everything about being human. Then, maybe by accident, a piece of meat fell too close to the flame. It smelled different, it looked different, and out of hunger, someone finally tasted it. It was softer, it was easier to chew, and it needed far less effort to eat. It seems small, but that single discovery may be the moment everything changed. Because cooking doesn't just change the taste of food, it changes what the body gets from it. Cooked food is softer, easier to break down, and far less work for teeth and stomach alike. Cooked starches and proteins are already partly broken down before they even reach the stomach. Heat unravels proteins and softens plant fibers, unlocking calories that raw food kept locked away. Suddenly, the same piece of meat delivered more usable energy than it ever had before. And once one person learned this, it did not take long for the whole group to follow. Fire was no longer just protection from predators. It had become the center of daily life. Some anthropologists place the origins of cooking as far back as 1.9 million years ago. Around the same time, the human body itself began to visibly change. Cooked food needed less digestive machinery, so over generations, the human gut began shrinking. Compared to other primates our size, human intestines are roughly 60% smaller than expected. A smaller gut is cheaper to maintain, and that saved energy had to go somewhere else. That energy, scientists argue, helped fuel one of the most expensive organs in the body, the brain. This idea even has a name among researchers, the expensive tissue hypothesis. Within roughly 1 million years, brain size in our lineage very nearly doubled. More brain power meant better tools, sharper thinking, and more complex problem solving. With extra energy no longer spent on digestion, there was more room for planning, memory, and speech. The campfire itself became something new, a place where the group gathered after the sun went down. Anthropologists sometimes call this humanity's first social hour. Daylight was for surviving, but firelight became a stretch of time for something more, for talking. Stories, warnings, plans for the next hunt, all of it passed easily around the flames. Older members of the group could now pass down knowledge that once might have simply been lost. Bonds formed differently now, built not just on survival, but on shared time and shared warmth. Cooking offered something else too, something quieter but just as vital: safety. Raw meat carries parasites and bacteria that heat simply destroys. Fewer parasites meant fewer illnesses, and fewer illnesses meant a better chance of surviving to old age. In a world without medicine, that single advantage could mean the difference between life and death. Cooking also opened up entirely new foods that raw diets simply couldn't use. Tough roots and starchy tubers, nearly indigestible raw, became rich sources of energy once heated. Some studies suggest cooking can boost the usable calories from certain foods by well over 30%. With more reliable food available, groups could travel farther and settle in places once too harsh to survive. A single fire had somehow rewritten the rules of where humans could even live. Fire meant warmth in cold climates, and warmth meant regions once impossible to inhabit were suddenly open. Slowly, fire and cooking became inseparable from what it meant to be human, wherever humans went. This whole idea has a name in modern science: the cooking hypothesis. The idea was popularized by primatologist Richard Wrangham in the early 2000s. He argued that cooking, not meat-eating alone, was the true engine behind human brain growth. Without the extra calories from cooked food, he says, our brains simply wouldn't have had the fuel to grow. No known human population in history has ever survived long-term on a fully raw diet. Even today, people attempting entirely raw diets often struggle to maintain enough weight and energy. This gap in calories is one of the strongest pieces of evidence behind the cooking hypothesis. Not every scientist agrees on exactly when cooking began, though. Some argue the earliest fire evidence is too scattered and thin to prove regular, daily cooking. Ash layers can come from wildfires just as easily as from a deliberately tended hearth. Estimates for regular, habitual cooking range anywhere from nearly 2 million years ago to around 400,000. By around 400,000 years ago, the evidence for deliberate, everyday cooking becomes undeniable. Hearths appear again and again, organized, reused, clearly built with intention. Cooking techniques themselves grew more refined: roasting, drying, even early forms of smoking meat. Smoking and drying meat over fire meant food could now be preserved for days, even weeks. For the first time, humans could plan ahead instead of eating everything the same day it was found. That kind of planning meant groups could survive lean seasons that once would have been deadly. With cooking as a shared task, roles within the group began to specialize for the first time. Preparing food became a skill of its own, passed down and practiced like any craft. That knowledge got taught, refined, and carried forward across generations. And through all of this, brains kept growing, generation after generation. By the time modern Homo sapiens emerged, cooking wasn't a discovery anymore. It was simply the norm. In fact, modern humans may no longer be biologically capable of thriving without it. Our jaws grew smaller, our teeth grew smaller, and our chewing muscles grew noticeably weaker. Our whole skull shape shifted, following the shrinking demands of a much softer diet. In a strange way, the very shape of the modern human face is a fingerprint left by fire. Eating together, around a shared fire, at a shared time, became a daily ritual for the first time in history. That ritual, some argue, is the true ancestor of the family meal we still practice today. Meals became moments for stories, for teaching, for simply being together. Across the ancient world, fire became the quiet, glowing thread tying human communities together. In a real sense, an entire species began organizing its life around a single flame. And with a bigger brain and a smaller gut, humans were now equipped for something far larger than survival. Energy once spent purely on digestion was now available for thinking, planning, and imagining. Some researchers even connect this surplus of brain power to the rise of art, symbols, and early belief. A species freed from constant digestion had time, for the first time, to wonder about the world around it. Curiosity itself may owe something to that first cooked meal. Fertile river valleys became easier to settle, since fire meant safety, warmth, and dependable food. As humans spread out of Africa, they carried fire and cooking with them into every new environment. Without fire and cooked food, surviving Europe's Ice Age winters would have been nearly impossible. Cooked, fat-rich meat gave the calories needed to survive brutal cold that raw food never could have covered. In every meaningful sense, cooking was technology, humanity's very first energy revolution. Eventually, humans stopped needing to find fire at all. They learned to make it themselves, on demand. That final step, creating fire on command, may be one of the most underrated inventions in our history. From that point forward, entire settlements could be built and organized around a central hearth. Cooking would eventually lead to boiling, to early pottery, and to entirely new ways of preparing food. Every kitchen, every stove, every meal you've ever eaten traces its lineage back to that first flame. It's strange to think something so ordinary once completely rewired a species. But that's exactly what happened, somewhere in Africa, hundreds of thousands of years before recorded history. A bigger brain, a smaller gut, safer food, and a longer life, all traced back to one small habit. It's easy to imagine that first fire tender as unremarkable, just trying to get through another hungry day. They had no idea that single choice would ripple forward for 2 million years. Every following generation inherited a slightly different body, a slightly bigger brain, a slightly easier life. And in a very real, very literal sense, that discovery is part of why you exist at all. Every meal you've ever shared with someone else has a thread running back to a fire like this one. Raw food kept our ancestors alive, but cooked food made us who we are.